Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this special BorrowBox online webinar with Pip Williams. I can see you all entering into the room. Feel welcome to let us know where you are watching this event from. We know that we've got people registered from all around Australia and New Zealand and even the UK. So thank you to the UK people who've got up very early. It is 7 o'clock where I am on a Wednesday evening. So I know some of you are probably at about 8 a.m. in the morning where you're dialing in from. So let us know. We would love to hear from you, and thank you for joining us for this special session. We'll just wait till everyone has joined in. So we've got Carla from the Gold Coast. Hello, Julie. Quite a few checking out the setup. And for those of you who are not familiar, you can enter your name and where you're tuning in from into the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll be able to see that you can log in a comment there. Hello, Natalie from Ireland. Got Anne-Marie from Ireland. Karen from Maribyrnong in Melbourne. And Julie's saying it's hot and windy on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. It's been very peculiar weather here in Melbourne. I definitely agree. It's crazy. Hello, Deirdre from Sydney. Hello, Carolyn from Hartley in South Australia. So maybe near where you are, Pip. We've got Scylla from Wales. We were just talking about them before. Helen from Mount Barker in South Australia, Mandy from Mannum in South Australia, a lot of South Australian people here, which makes sense. Penny from Perth, and Anne and Pete in Geelong. And we've got Mackay Regional Library, so checking in. Welcome, Mackay. Jan from Northcote in Melbourne, Goolwa in South Australia. Hi, Kath. Yeppoon in Queensland, and Jack from Sydney. Famous character, obviously, in the book. Karen from South Wales. Wodonga, Kathy and Jeff in England. Gosh, there's everyone. Susan in Adelaide. Susanna in Portsmouth, England. Jacqueline from Newcastle. Helmy in Darwin. Gosh, there's so many. I can still see the numbers climbing for everyone entering, so we'll just give it a couple more minutes before we officially start. Hello, Linda from Mosgiel in New Zealand. Nicola from Newcastle. Sarah from Warkworth in New Zealand. I think they're a bit ahead of us. So it's actually probably at about 9 p.m, I think, in New Zealand at the moment. Linley from Dunedin in New Zealand. We've got Rachel from Wollongong, Darawal country. Jen from Bustleton in WA. They're coming from all over the place. Kerry from Altona North. Yes, we are going to be recording this and putting it up on our BorrowBox YouTube channel. And Teesdale from Victoria. Evelyn from Lichfield. Melbourne, Queensland, Gold Coast, Fitzroy. Gosh, they're from all over. It's a lot from South Australia. It's hard to.
Yeah, I should say a special hello to was it Helen from Mount Barker?
Yes.
That's my local.
Oh, that's your local library.
My local area, yeah. So, and my local library.
Great. Oh, that's great. Great.
And I should say hello to everybody in Wales, yeah, which is where I'm from originally.
I love that. I just found that out before. I have a strong affinity with Wales, so that's really good. Still got people checking in, so we might just wait another minute or two so they don't miss any of this amazing talk that's going to happen. So we've got Maz from Bowra. And she's saying she went to a fermenting workshop at Yungai. Not sure. Diane from South Coast, England. Judy from Gloucester. Judy and Heather from near Oxford. Wow, well, that's going to be... They know all about this area then. I'm sure they loved this book. Cassie from Bentley. Jackie from a very hot Kerrang in Victoria. Yeah, it's been very hot on this East Coast. And Jeanette from Ulverstone in Tasmania. It's stormy thunder, lightning and rain. So welcome to Australia and the variety of weather. Anna from Fremantle, still climbing. Well, we might just get started and people can join us as we get into. I just want to say hello and welcome to everyone. My name is Natasha and I have been in the content role at BorrowBox for the last 5 years. I'm based in Melbourne in Australia, and it is my absolute delight to be hosting this event with the amazing best-selling author Pip Williams. And I want to thank you all for joining us, whatever time frame you are in. And I know that you're all here as fans of the books that Pip has written, or maybe you haven't actually read these books yet and you're wanting to learn more about them. We'd like to begin this event by recognising that we are paying our respects to the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we're meeting and having this event, and where you might be watching from, and also welcome any First Nations people who might be present. We acknowledge and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge them as the original storytellers of this land. I am hosting this event from the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and Pip is speaking to us from Peramunk country. So before we begin, just some housekeeping matters. Our event today is planned to go for about an hour, and it's all about getting to know Pip and her wonderful novels and her research and her writing. We've intentionally turned everyone's cameras and microphones off so you can fully concentrate on the talk that we're going to have. The first half will be me discussing the novels with Pip, and then we're going to open it up to you, the audience, for the second half. And you can do that by the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which many of you have already shown that you know how that works. So that is great. So when you are writing any of your questions that you might have, please let us know which library you are a member of, because I would think that all of you have heard about this wonderful event that BorrowBox is hosting because you have the BorrowBox app on your phone and you're a member of a local library that hosts BorrowBox. And as we've seen, we've got people from all around Australia, New Zealand and the UK tuning in this, and this is where you can get BorrowBox. So let us know where you're checking in from. I should say that we are going to record this event and it'll be available on our BorrowBox YouTube channel later next week. So if you want to have a re-listen, or if you want to share it with any friends who are unable to join us today. So thank you. So let me introduce our guest, Pip Williams. She was born in London, but hailing from Wales, Welsh parents, and grew up in Sydney and now lives in the Adelaide Hills of South Australia with her family and an assortment of animals. She spent most of her working life as a social researcher, and then she wrote a memoir called One Italian Summer that was about her family trying to find the good life. And this was published to wide acclaim from Affirm Press. She then went on to write her first novel, The Dictionary of Lost Words, that was based on her original research at the Oxford English Dictionary Archives. And that was published in 2020, and it became an instant international bestseller. It has sold over 500,000 copies in Australia and New Zealand, and it is pushing 1.5 million copies of sales total worldwide. It is just absolutely extraordinary and very well deserved. Its much anticipated companion novel, The Bookbinder of Jericho, became an instant #1 bestseller when it was published this year in April. And Belinda Publishing is really proud to have recorded the audiobooks exclusively for these novels. Welcome, Pip.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is so exciting. It's great to be here.
I have loved these books since before they were released, because I was very lucky that in this job I got an advanced copy, what we call an advanced reading copy, or an ARC, and you can see it behind me there. And I immediately dived in and I was swept away to the place, to the time, the characters that jumped alive off the page. And then imagine my delight, like so many others, where we then got a companion novel this year set alongside the sort of same time period with some of the same characters, The Bookbinder of Jericho. And it really, I felt like there was so many little nugget gems when you were reading both of them, where there were characters appearing in both books, or there was a crossing of paths. Tilda, my absolute favorite, who I adored. Gareth Owen, who crosses paths, obviously, with Jack. I'm trying not to do any spoilers. And then Peggy, when she's reading Esme's Women's Words of Meaning Dictionary. I mean, there's just so much blending. So I wanted to start by asking you, when you were researching and writing the dictionary, and I'll use just that as an abbreviation term, when did the idea for Bookbinder kind of germinate and have little buds?
So I had almost finished writing dictionary. I was in the archives in Oxford at Oxford University Press in November 2019.
Just in
Literally,
time.
yeah, just finishing, just sort of filling in a few research gaps, really. So I had a full manuscript. I'd edited a full manuscript. I just had a few things I wanted to, a few gaps I wanted to fill in. And one of them was I was writing a scene about the making of a book at Oxford University Press that was a book that was being bound in secret. And I wanted to know, how did the women in the bindery do their job? And so I asked the archivist just to bring me everything that he had about the women who worked in the bindery during World War I. And he hardly had anything. He brought me a photograph of women folding the pages. He brought me, he reintroduced me, because he'd already introduced me to a film called The Making of a Book at Oxford University Press. It was a black and white silent film that was made in the early 1920s.
Beautiful.
And in that film, there's a beautiful bit of footage of a women folding the pages, but also of a woman gathering the sections onto her arm. She's elegant, she's stylish, she's almost dancing along the gathering bench. She's fast. But the one thing that struck me, I was interested in, was I wonder what book it is that she's gathering. Like, and
Yeah.
I remember pausing the video and peering in to see if I could see what book it was, but I couldn't. But then I wondered, did she ever stop to read what it was she was gathering into her arms? And as soon as I had that thought, I had a character.
Yeah.
Because I realized that if she did stop to read it, someone would come over and reprimand her. So suddenly I had a character who wanted something to read, who couldn't, who was being stopped, who was having challenges put in her way. And that's when the idea for Peggy struck me. But I was writing another book. I hadn't finished dictionary. So I wrote down a few ideas and then put it aside. But because I was so enamored by this idea of a woman who essentially wanted to read and was told that her job was to bind the books, not read them, that line popped into my head immediately.
Right.
And that's the line I wrote down. And from there, I very quickly had a sense of who this woman was and what she might have wanted, which was to actually attend the university rather than be a servant of the university. And so it sort of percolated in the back of my mind, because I had to finish this other book. But at the same time, because it was in the back of my mind, it meant that I was able to seed it ever so slightly in the dictionary of lost words, because I hadn't yet handed over the manuscript. So I could imagine Peggy somehow, in the background of that story.
There's so many beautiful moments from dictionary to Bookbinder. There's that reference when Tilda returns and she's been with someone that Esme is not knowing at that point, but and there's even the reference to the narrowboats at that time. Yeah. Tilda says that being on a narrowboat is like being a sardine lying in the sun. I loved that your description of place is so evocative, whether it's in the scriptorium or in the bindery, the universities. This world just comes alive in the early 20th century. And you make this decision to actually have a life or a home on the waterways, on the narrowboats. I just thought it was an absolutely clever and really different, unusual place for a little family unit who have other little family units like the Roundtrees next to them. So I wondered what had actually inspired you to put Peggy and Maud, her twin sister, and their mother Helen, before she obviously passes, to be on these narrowboats, and had you had any experience with narrowboats, where this idea even popped up from?
Well, I know that your people tuning in from Oxford, and anyone who's visited Oxford can't help but notice all of the narrowboats that are on the canals. around that place, and actually all over England. You know, England has a huge canal system because it was one of the main forms of cargo transport prior to the Industrial Revolution. And so narrowboats are just ubiquitous in England. You'd be very hard pressed to find a narrowboat in Australia. And so,
Sure.
but one of my habits when I write is to immerse myself in the places that I'm writing. So I have traveled to the UK and to Oxford many times and stayed there for extended periods. And when I was there writing the Dictionary of Lost Words, in which there are no canal boats or boats, I still wandered the canals all the time. And so narrowboats were everywhere. And I was sort of, you know, romantically enamored by them. I loved the idea of them. I really, really love writing contained places for my characters. The scriptorium is an example, and the narrowboat Calliope is another example. But I feel like all of us are so influenced by the place that we call home. And it's not always our house. You know, it could be a library at school, but it's the place where you feel welcome. It's the place where you feel comfortable and safe. It's the place that inspires you often. It's the place where you daydream. And so I really wanted to have places like that for my characters. So the main reason I have a narrowboat is because I was so interested in them, and I could see that a narrowboat would make a very interesting place for Peggy and Maud to live. And at the time I was writing, a narrowboat would have been a relatively cheap place to live, and working class women who had no extra support. The other thing, though, is it's not unknown in literature to write about narrowboats. And in fact, Penelope Fitzgerald, who is a very well-known English writer, she wrote a Booker-winning book called, what was it called? Offshore. And it won the 1979 Booker Prize. And it's about a community of people who live on the waterways. They're not all narrowboats. It's a kind of collection of different types of liveaboard boats. But I remember reading that and being really taken by the various ways that people can live on board a boat. So that is probably one of the first examples for me.
And it is a home for them. I think, you know, you describe it so well. And then when Gwen comes in for the dinner, and it's so shocking to her that there's books everywhere and this is how they live, but they have that beautiful meal. I thought it would be really a great point here for you to perhaps share a passage from the book, because I know that we were talking about the description right at the beginning. I don't know whether you want to set it up for us, the passage that you're going to read, or if we just dive right in.
Well, I'll set it up. It doesn't need much setting up. It is right at the very beginning. And you've already mentioned the narrowboat and Helen and the twins. And so this just introduces you to all of those things, really. And it is right near the start, as you can see. So there are no spoilers. It was a relief to look upon Calliope. She was dark blue with gold lettering, like the binding of an Oxford World's classic. She was practically touching staying put, and the closeness had always felt like a comfort. I held open the hatch for Maud and stepped in after her. Calliope smelled a little sweet after having been shut up all day, a little earthy. The hatch swung closed behind me and I breathed it in. It's the smell of books, Ma used to tell people when they asked. It's the paper decomposing. They'd screw up their noses and Ma would laugh and say, I've come to love it. Ma had brought 2 books with her when she first moved on to Calliope, translations of the Odyssey and the Tragedies of Euripides, Volume 2. They'd belonged to her own mother and were worn from reading. Her collecting had only started after we were born. She picked up books at curiosity shops and fetes, and sometimes she bought them new, Everyman's Library editions for $1 each. Most, though, were from the press. They were bound, but they had defects. Whenever I asked if she'd been given permission to bring one home, She'd never quite answer. It's waste, she'd say, not good enough to sell. Then she'd hand it to me, but good enough to read, don't you think? I always said yes, though when I was small, I could barely understand a word of them. Ma stored her books on a row of narrow shelving that ran between the windows bow to stern. When those shelves were full, Oberon Roundtree built her another row. Soon after that, he built another. When we were 10 years old, he told her a fourth row of shelves could not be accommodated. So Ma bought a small bookcase from the bric-a-brac woman at the covered market. It had been dragged from the river at low tide and looked worthless. But Ma cleaned it, then sanded it, then oiled it. She placed it beside her armchair just inside the hatch. Then she filled it with her favourite novels and all her Greek myths. Why do we have so many books? I like to ask. To expand your world, she would always say. When she died, my world shrank.
So beautiful. And I love the idea that this book within books, it's like a book within a book, and how you share their love of reading as a family who don't have much. You know, they're working class, but because of where they work, they get this exposure. Yeah. I think that's just so beautiful, the kind of story that you place them in. It's when Peggy came to you, did you imagine that this was going to be that she would have a sister, a twin sister, Maud? Because one of the things I find really interesting is the kind of the comfort, but also the family duty aspect that comes through with the twin sisters of Maud and Peggy. And I love Maud. She's so perceptive. She's really striving to have her own autonomy. And then Peggy actually goes through this, her own kind of coming of age journey where she's felt like a copy, an echo. And then she actually realizes that perhaps she is, you know, stifling her own dreams and doesn't need to be so worried about Maud, and actually what it means for her to be a better sister. And I wondered if they had always been twins. Was that in early drafts? And what was the reason perhaps to depict this family as having twins, not just being sisters?
Maud was there right from the beginning. So as soon as I had that idea about, you know, a woman who wanted more than she had, particularly a woman who wanted education, at a time when women found it difficult to get education, but particularly working class women, because it was an expensive thing, not just a gendered thing. So I had this idea about a woman who had the usual barriers to her dream, which was gender and class. But I wanted, in some ways, to, I suppose I wanted more than that. I wanted her to have to struggle against something that actually women today have to struggle against all the time. Not to say that women don't still have to struggle against gender and class barriers. They do, and particularly in different parts of our country and different parts of the world, they do. But when we think that we've come so far, in inverted commas, the one thing that hasn't really changed for anyone, man or woman, is what happens when you have a caring obligation. And for so many people, care gets in the way of dreams, whether it's the care of small children, whether it's the care of an older child with some kind of intellectual or physical disability, whether it's the care of older parents or older siblings who are unwell, or whatever it might be. It could be the care of an old dog. And I'm not saying that lightly. For so many people, our pets are everything. And it means sometimes we can't do things because the pet needs us. And so I was really interested to explore all of those complexities of caring for somebody that you love, because of course there's love there, but there's often also resentment. There's often a whole lot of other emotions and thoughts that go through our minds, and I'm saying our because, you know, I'm not exempt from this, that goes through our minds when we're caring for somebody, but also trying to achieve something for ourselves. And that was a really interesting thing for me to think about. And then Maud was just, I so loved writing Maud for so many reasons, because she was a challenging character to write.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I didn't want to do is write a trope. I didn't want Maud to be
Tokenistic,
but I certainly didn't want her to be that trope of a character who is needing support, and the story really is all about how their sister kind of overcomes this challenge of having somebody in their life that needs them. I wanted her to have her own story arc. I wanted her to have agency. I wanted her to kind of defy the stereotype, but also the expectation within the story. And I wanted to give her genuine kind of difference, because I have people like Maud in my life, and I don't want to constantly read about people like Maud as people who don't have agency, as people who aren't unique and have a unique way of seeing the world and are seen as unique. But that's okay. That's just a difference. And I wanted to explore what that difference could mean for Maud and all of the people around her. And it was so interesting to do that, and to try and do it respectfully, but also to try and do it realistically.
I think you really travel a really good, tender, fine line there. And I think you do it so well, because Maud does really have an insight into people, Jack, and then Lot, the pain of people or the need of people. I feel like it's such a beautiful expression of how her character has her own relationships that are separate to the relationships of Peggy. I think it's that kind of contrast between the two of them and the stories that they're going on for themselves. And then that obligation, like you're saying, that Peggy feels, it's just she has to learn to kind of let go of that a bit. And how can she do that but still not feel guilty? It's just beautiful to travel along with them as particularly Peggy's coming to terms with that.
Yeah, thank you. And also the other challenge was I was really, because language is something that I explore in both of these novels. And I wanted to see how I could limit language but still make it powerful. And so Maud only echoes what she hears around her. So her vocabulary is limited by what she hears, but she uses it very particularly. And so, trying to make her understood, she doesn't have many lines in the book, but her lines are some of the most important. And that's something I was trying to, I suppose, play with, but also understand in a more general sense, is how people who communicate differently can still be understood if we learn to decipher the language. That's what it's all about. And
I love them tucked up in their bed together because of being on the narrowboat, and the little private conversations they have. And Maud kind of highlights some things to Peggy at a certain point of what her mother had said. And then she says that to comfort Peggy in a really difficult time. I mean, Maud is very savvy to understanding people's emotions. I think that's the thing that draws you in with her.
Yeah, and in the way of some people, she is very tuned into people's emotions, but she doesn't take on other people's emotions in the same way that others around her might.
Yes.
Which makes her actually a much more effective carer sometimes.
Yes. You document in Dictionary of Lost Words, there's a real life character, Edith Thompson, who is affectionately known as Dita. And she obviously is a role model for Esme. And she says, words are our way of resurrection. And I think it's really interesting, you coming from a social research background, and then you get this inspiration to write a novel. And I wondered how you then had to grapple with looking at words and writing words in a much more creative way than you perhaps had previously in your other work, and what that might have involved in terms of altering your habits or editing your work from going from research nonfiction to now writing fiction.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Actually, someone once asked me, why didn't I just write like a nonfiction book about the dictionary and about the dictionary being gendered and so on? And my answer was because maybe 5 people would read it. You know, and there was so much, I had questions for both of these books. I start with questions that I'm curious to answer for myself. And I know that reading nonfiction isn't necessarily going to be the most pleasurable way to answer those questions or to explore those questions. For me, writing the Dictionary of Lost Words, I wrote it as a novel for 2 reasons. I couldn't actually find enough evidence for what I was thinking to write anything other than fiction.
Yeah.
I had to explore it in a fictional way because there simply wasn't enough out there looking at whether or not dictionaries and other documents, for instance, are gendered. That's not to say there's nothing out there. There's a wonderful dictionary scholar called Linda Mugglestone with the most wonderful name.
Yes.
And she was she was at Oxford. I don't know if she still is, but she wrote a wonderful book called Lost for Words. And that is, you know, all about words that are missing from dictionaries. And she has a feminist approach to her research. But the fact is, I knew that more people, if it was well enough written, more people would read a novel than would read a nonfiction book about this subject. And it was more pleasurable for me to write a novel than it was to write nonfiction, partly because if I wanted to, I could stray from the facts.
Yeah.
I could fill in the gaps, and you have to, because there are so many gaps. You know, not just history, but the archives are full of gaps that are shaped like women. So, you know, fiction is sometimes the only way to really explore something, because there is no archival material. Edith Thompson is, you mentioned Edith Thompson, and she's a really interesting character because for me, perhaps because I was a social scientist and the truth in inverted commas is so important to me, I never want to change the known facts. And when I say facts, I mean things like, you know, the dates of battles in World War I, you know, things we know for sure.
And they finished the dictionary in 1928.
Exactly. And the word smiggle was, you know, published in a certain fascicle at a certain time in history. So for me, it was really important to stick to the scaffold of history and not change any of those dates, not change any of those words, for instance, not change the timeline of the war or any of the battles or what was printed at Oxford University Press in different times in history. Those things are fixed for me. And then I weave the fiction through them. But Edith Thompson was she was a conundrum for me because she is a real person who volunteered for the Oxford English Dictionary and in fact contributed to every single volume that was published. So she worked on the dictionary for a good 50 years of her life. And yet there's hardly anything about her in the historical record.
An extraordinary commitment to the betterment of everyone that is to come after.
And she represents a whole lot of other people who made similar commitments. We know a bit about her because she was a historian herself, though not university educated, but very talented. And she wrote a history of England that was used as a textbook at schools in her time. She also wrote a book, I think, or she wrote about her grandfather who was a parliamentarian. And so we know a bit about her because of the men she wrote about. And I was determined not to excise her from the book that I was writing. I felt like she had been neglected in terms of her role in the dictionary and as a representative of so many other women who volunteered or worked on the dictionary. So many had been neglected, I suppose. And so I decided to use her real name, but the conundrum was that, of course, I fictionalized half of her life in my novel because she is Esme's godmother. And Esme is fictional. So, of course, that relationship never existed. And that's why I came up with the nickname Dita, Whenever she's in a relationship or a scene with Esme, she's referred to as Dita. But whenever she's doing her work on the dictionary, she's referred to as Miss Thompson or Edith Thompson, which is her real name. And so that's how I kind of managed that one kind of lapse in my dedication to the history. Yeah.
Bringing up Edith, there's so many characters throughout both books where we have women who have decided to not get married, and they've chosen a life to assert their power, as it were, to make a choice that they wouldn't be married. And they are role models or mentors to both Esme and Peggy. And obviously this is all happening at the same time as the women's suffrage movement, where they're trying to get the vote. I loved the little nod that you put into the fact that South Australia had got the vote well before the UK women.
You don't think that was a bit indulgent?
Before the rest of Australia. I thought it was a marvellous little stroke there. That was and the
I should stop you there for just a second. I get mail from New Zealanders, and I know there's a few watching, reminding me that women got the vote in New Zealand the year before South Australia. But actually, South Australia is the first place in the world where women could vote and run for Parliament.
Yes.
And so and
Indigenous women as well.
And Indigenous women as well, and men. Yes. They had the vote as well back in the 19th century. And a lot of Australians don't realise that.
No. Yeah. And then it's taken off them when obviously we go to federation.
Yeah, they couldn't vote, at a national level.
At a national level. Yeah. As these women are asserting themselves and finding their voice and their power, you make the decision that both Esme and Peggy together actually claim for themselves a sort of sexual freedom. How important was it that you have these unmarried women be role models, and then how Esme and Peggy very differently in both books, and how those relationships and the sex scenes, I have to say, are written so beautifully and tenderly, particularly with Bastian, like it was just, break your heart. And they go on different paths through that sexual journey, and then where they end up, at the end of that kind of relationship that they have. How did you decide to tie that in, and why you thought it was important to tie in this aspect for a time that we probably might be a bit shocking for earlier 20th century?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. First of all, many women, if they wanted to do anything other than be a mother, they had to choose between marriage and that other thing. It's not that they wanted to choose between those two things, they had to choose. So Somerville College, and I know this I think it was from Vera Britton's memoir, the faculty at Somerville College during World War I were almost all of them were single women, and I think only one of them had a child, because they couldn't be an academic and a mother. And so I got my understanding of some of these choices and these women from the history. The same with all of the women that I talk about in the Dictionary of Lost Words. You're absolutely right. Most of them were not married, let alone had children. And that's because they worked and they couldn't do both. So it was quite rare back then for a woman to be able to choose to have it all. It really was quite rare. The other thing that you talk about is this sexual freedom. And I think we have a misunderstanding about societies in the past. I think we think that they were far more moralistic than they were, and conservative than they were. There's so much evidence to suggest that's not the case. There's so much. I mean, you just need to look at the number of women who died in backyard abortions to know that women were having sex outside marriage. But not just that. The Edwardian period in particular was a very modern period of time. It was a bit of a sexual revolution in its own right. And there's a lot of there's a lot of writing about that. I mean, the Bloomsbury Group are a good example of that, but people often say they were an anomaly. But I actually came across other things that sort of indicate that a certain amount of experimenting and sexual freedom was not uncommon. And particularly during wartime, it's even more common because of the threat of death. So when life is threatened, people behave differently. And one of the things that they do is they have more fun with each other. So this wasn't, and in fact, in Oxford, it's not in the book. It's one of those little factoids that it would have been lovely to put in, but I had to resist the urge. But in Oxford, they actually hired or allowed a woman to become a police officer, which hadn't happened before, so that she could patrol and talk to women directly who were acting and behaving slightly loosely around the canals.
Wow.
Because women were, having
that's another book right there.
Having a lot more fun.
That's
and this is what was happening in wartime. Young women were having far more relationships and far more sex than we think. And so it wasn't so shocking for the time, but we think it is now.
And it allows those characters, the two protagonists, to really make choices for themselves about how they want to pursue their own future. I think it's just great. Just before we open up to questions, so for the audience, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A button at the bottom. I'm just going to ask one more question and then we'll open up to the audience. Bookbinder of Jericho obviously deals with some really big issues and themes. So we obviously have gender, class, the women's suffrage movement, how words are defining and restricting or holding back people. But it all happens and permeates through the novel with the little everyday, ordinary decisions and lives that are sort of happening alongside them. And I wondered how, when you were crafting this story, you balance the idea of wanting to push through the history that you had read in terms of the thematic concerns and then the everyday minutiae of what's going on with people's lives, and how you kind of balance that for yourself in the writing.
Actually, it's actually a really easy question to answer. The characters have to lead the historical content. I can't tell a story about history. I have to tell a story about people. And all I'm doing is setting those people in a particular time and place, and then observing what might have happened in that time and place, and how those characters, how those people might have responded, might have been affected by, etc. If I did want to write a book about history, about a particular time and place, it would be very different. It probably should be nonfiction.
And did you feel that the characters then were leading you, or you knew from the get-go where you wanted them to go, or did they take you in a surprising way?
A bit of both. So I can't help but get a pretty big picture idea of a story very early on in my writing. It's just the way my mind works. It leaps ahead. So I had an idea of the story structure, but as I write each scene, it takes on a life of its own. And that's when the characters, I really follow, well, what would they do now? How would they respond, et cetera, what might happen? And that can change. That can have a knock-on effect and change the overall story. But on the whole, both these books have ended up the way I thought they would. I have to admit, with Bookbinder, there's this central question. Peggy basically wants to be a scholar, and this is her dream. I can tell, I won't spoil the conclusion, but I can tell you absolutely honestly, I did not know whether or not she would achieve that dream. And that was really important for me. And I'm not telling you whether or not she does. But I didn't know the answer to that. And I think that was important, actually, in the writing of that story.
It unfurls in a way, and we get surprised at many points in the story, not just with that sort of plot thread, but it's interesting to hear you say that you were kind of going along And we then feel the surprise in the rhythm of those words and the structure. It kind of unfurls in a surprising way. It's remarkable.
Oh, thank you. I don't know if it's remarkable, but one of the things for me is, I suppose, there's always this tension between realism, like what might really happen, and the romance of an idea. And when I get too caught up in the romance, I have to question whether or not I'm doing the kind of writing that I want to do.
Yes.
And, you know, so there's a little bit of a tug of war.
We all need a bit of romance when the world is looking grim and dark.
Between making something happen because you really, really want it to happen, or making something happen because it might be the most likely outcome.
It's a hard decision you would have. I can see. And it's that kill your darlings kind of aspect with certain characters that will say that don't make it all the way through. You know, I did shed a tear both times.
And I did. I remember writing scenes in both books when I didn't know what would happen until I literally was writing the sentences.
Yes.
And I remember particularly in dictionary writing something happened and I was bawling my eyes out, and I went back and rewrote it so it had a different ending, and it just didn't work.
No.
And I knew that even as much as I didn't want it to happen, it had to happen.
And then that gets picked up in Bookbinder and you cry all over again. I know. I'm going to turn to some questions now because we've got quite a few. Lou from Hay in New South Wales says, in both the dictionary and Bookbinder, I really felt myself walking along Walton Street, cycling along the towpath next to the canal and wandering through the covered market. Does this strong sense of place come from your personal long association with Jericho and the surrounding area of Oxford, or were you able to just create it from a visit or two? Because obviously when you wrote Bookbinder, we were then in COVID times.
Yeah, that's right. But I am from the UK, so originally, and I go back every few years to visit friends and family. So I've been to Oxford a few times before I started writing these books. But when I started writing dictionary, I had, I think, 3 research trips, and I would stay for an extended period of time. I'd live there for a little bit, like for weeks, not months and months. And when I finally could go back after COVID, I did manage to go back in June 2022. To do the final research for Bookbinder. I was lucky that I'd been able to go so often for the first book because I had so many resources and materials and things I'd collected from that time. But I'd also developed relationships with people in Oxford who could, like, so particularly Dr. Martin Moore is the archivist at Oxford University Press, and he was just at the end of the, email constantly when I was asking for information about whatever. And he would send me information. So that was fantastic. And if I hadn't already established that relationship, I'm not sure I would have contacted him so often.
So often, yes. Yeah. Rhonda from Tamworth in New South Wales says, I was lucky to attend the Sydney Theatre Company production of the Dictionary of Lost Words on the weekend, and it was a superb presentation. I'm really looking forward to seeing it when it comes to Melbourne next year. Were you involved in the planning of the play?
I didn't have anything to do with the writing, but I did meet with Verity Lawton a number of times. In fact, we're friends now, and we would talk about the book. And for me, it was wonderful because at that very first meeting that we had over coffee, I knew she understood what I had tried to achieve in the novel, and it felt very comfortable handing it over to her. For me, it's really important to be able to do that, because a play, it's also been optioned for a limited series, and someone is turning it into a concerto as well.
Yeah, can you talk about the concerto? Because I think this is very recent news that people maybe don't know.
But in every case, these are creatives, at the top of their game, and they don't want another creative who knows nothing about their particular area to meddle. And so it was very important for me to be able to hand it over comfortably, which is what I did for the play. The book concerto, Marion Budos, who lives in Canberra, is a composer, and he has written a book concerto before. And basically he gives the main characters an instrument and then composes music around the story and those instruments. And so Esme is going to be played by a harp, and I think it will premiere in Adelaide in 2025. So I can't wait to see it. I have no idea what this will sort of be like, but apparently the concerto follows the story of the book. So it will be really interesting.
I think it will be tremendous. How did you feel when you watched the play in it as a performance?
It's really strange because I didn't realize this until I sat down in the audience and it starts. And someone might laugh or cry at a particular line, which I actually recognize because it's a line I actually wrote. So even though I didn't have anything to do with writing the play, there are a lot of words in that play that are from the book. And I would look across to someone sitting beside me laughing or crying or whatever, or yawning. That didn't happen too much. And I realize as a writer, you never watch someone read your book ever. So on one level, it was very confronting. On another, it was an enormous privilege. And I was very humbled by it, essentially. And I think Verity Lawton, who's the playwright, and Jessica Arthur, who's the director, and all of the actors did an amazing job. I honestly...
I'm so excited to see it. I mean, as you know, I love theatre, so I'm really excited just to experience the story in a different form. Tracy has said, if it's not too personal, could you please tell us about the first time you saw your book for sale in a shop? And I imagine it was beyond thrilling. She's from Mitcham Council Library.
It was beyond thrilling, and it was actually the first book I ever saw was an academic book, which is kind of a bit different. But when I first saw One Italian Summer, which is my memoir, which is, I call it my Luke Hemsworth.
Okay.
As in there's 3 Hemsworth brothers, and Luke is the smallest and least popular. But he's still quite good looking.
Very important. Very important. Yeah.
So I call One Italian Summer my Luke Hemsworth because I really value it. And I still really love that book, and seeing that book for the first time was amazing. But because my name is Williams, it's always right down on the bottom shelf.
Not if you're on my shelf, because I've color-coded. So I don't normally color code, but I have today. Yes.
Yeah. So I do remember, especially going into airports, and my partner or a friend would sort of bring it up from the bottom shelf and stick it a little higher. And, we did all those things, but it was quite thrilling.
Do you think that Bookbinder of Jericho, is there any options that are happening for that to be turned into another art form now that Dictionary of Lost Words has become a play, a concerto, possibly optioned for a limited series? Is there talk of Bookbinder? It would seem...
Not yet. No, not yet. And if there was, I'd say, there might be, but, I can't tell you. No, nothing's sort of in the works yet.
Yeah,
so.
Okay. Someone has just said, Mandy, thanks for your thoughts on weaving facts and real people into your story. My first book is a piece of creative nonfiction, and I call it this because although the story is true, the dialogue is recreated from 1938 to 2019. Do you think that's the best way to describe this type of story?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Creative nonfiction is already a kind of way to describe nonfiction that is narrative. That's another way to describe it, as narrative nonfiction. So it's nonfiction that's meant to read like a story. Interestingly, when I was a social scientist, that's how I did try to write, because I did a lot of qualitative research. And you asked a question earlier actually about, using the particular story of individuals in a historical context. In a way, that's what I used to do as a social scientist. I would use individual stories to demonstrate larger social science themes, because it is the particular that is important when you're telling a story. And I am I'm the kind of person who, in even creative nonfiction, believes that it's okay to put in dialogue as long as there's a clear understanding that, this is your memory of something, or that dialogue is representative of the meaning of certain conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the truth is nobody remembers history exactly.
Mm.
Not biographers, historians, nobody is recalling history exactly as it was played out. There is always a subjective element to anything that we do, even when we think we're telling the truth.
Mm.
And I think that has to be acknowledged. And so I think putting quotation marks around dialogue in nonfiction is okay, as long as it is representative of the meaning that is true.
And I think you just touch on, because obviously you made the decision that Bastian and Lot would be from Belgium, who have experienced great, tragedy in their country and come as refugees to the UK. I mean, it's something that, the world is always facing whenever there's a conflict, the refugees coming over and with that trauma. And I really appreciated how you confronted those very dark times as an experience, because what comes through in both books is the element of grief, and in all its forms. So for Peggy, with her mother, the anger, the hurt, the resentment, the regret, the guilt. Esme with her mother and her father, and missing his smell and turning to look and he's not there, and the absence of someone. And then when we hit in the wartime with Bookbinder, Tilda and Bastian and Lot, who have seen the tragedy up close of the loss of life, and Gareth and Jack, who are serving on the front as well. It must have been quite challenging to think about how people experience grief in different ways, and then to talk about those dark times of the war. I thought you did that really sensitively, and I wondered whether there was a passage that perhaps you found very difficult when you were sitting at the desk to write. And did you get stuck, and how did you get through that?
Yeah, actually, with dictionary, there are a few passages that I could talk about that I approach very differently. So without giving any spoilers, in both books, there are letter writers. And right towards the end of both books, the letter writer switches. So in both books, the letter writer in the first book is Edith Thompson. In the second book, it's Tilda. And they're bringing a part of the world to the reader that the protagonist can't, because it's first person, because they're not there.
Smart decision.
But right at the end of both books, one of the male characters writes a letter to one of the female characters. And in the first book, Gareth is writing a letter from the front. And I remember writing that letter and wondering, how do you write a letter when you're in hell? What do you write about? And so that, that took me, in some ways, it didn't take me as long as I thought it might, because what I did actually was try to inhabit that place and that person, and tried to imagine myself in that place and writing a letter, rather than trying to imagine myself as a writer, trying to, if that makes sense. I just tried to put myself in that place and write a letter to someone I loved.
Right.
That's what I did for that. But the second bit was actually writing about, there's a scene towards the end where Esme is visiting someone who's experiencing war neurosis or shell shock, PTSD essentially, in hospital. And he has lost his ability to understand English. And I read about this. So I did research, obviously, about the different ways of responding to trauma. But I had read about cases of war neuroses in World War I, and seen a black and white, and seen a video actually of a man who had lost his ability to understand English because the English language was so traumatizing from where he was. It was constantly bad news, except for one word, and that was the word bomb. And whenever he heard the word bomb, he would completely freak out and lose it. And there's footage of this that I saw. And he is the basis of the character that Esme is visiting in hospital. And really fast. So that is like this to and fro between the scriptorium and the hospital. It's a completely different style to the rest of the book. Similarly, when Esme was, well, it might be a spoiler, but Esme has a baby, and there's a, you know, another break in style, because these are experiences in some ways that they can't be experienced in the normal way. They're fragmented and and shattered in a way. And so I shattered up the style, and that's how I wrote those.
And and you do feel that sort of sharp left turn, and even in the Bookbinder, when reading is actually healing to the soldiers that are recovering through very traumatic injuries. And the interesting one where the class kind of comes in, where the guy doesn't want Peggy to be reading to him because he's of another class. I mean, that's just such a shocking, just a shocking moment. You know, you're kind of taken aback a bit, because you know that the intentions of all the women there that are reading to these men is well intentioned, and then this kind of happens. But the idea of reading as healing through an idea of wanting to do something and be useful, and then also working through a grief. I mean, it's a really nice kind of moment there that you get to sort of give to us to sort of reflect on.
Yeah, and there's a few things, you know, that reading is healing, but actually also there's a lot of cliche in a lot of the material that people were given to read during World War I as well. Cliche and propaganda. And, you know, there's an exchange between Peggy and Bastian where they're talking about Rudyard Kipling's poem If, and about everybody, and this idea that you should keep your head, even in circumstances that are
about losing their
just not normally, just not normal. You know, this sort of rallying cry to sort of stay on an even keel just doesn't work for everybody. And a lot of the poetry of that time too was, you know, was not reflective of people's experience. It turned soldiers into heroes and martyrs when they weren't very often. And it's not until Wilfred Owen that the poetry started to change and started to really reflect the experience of people at the front, and didn't idolize them, didn't turn them into sort of Jesus characters. And so, you know, the book kind of very lightly, I hope, but very lightly touches on some of these things.
I love how Bastian really has to come to terms with the fact of dealing with the trauma of what he's seen, and how he feels haunted by the dead people that he saw, and how he actually creatively tries to come to peace with that with the cemetery. I don't want to give anything away, but I just thought that was a beautiful way of him trying to heal himself so that he can move forward and not be traumatized by all of these memories. I mean, it was just a really beautiful scene, that.
Oh, thank you. And I, you know, like you said, everyone deals with trauma in different ways. And so the characters in this book, in fact, deal with trauma in very different ways.
And in a big way like war, but in a small way like losing your parents, you know, like it's the big and the small again. We've got another question here. Both Kerry and Kim, two questions where they're both saying, no pressure, but are you working on another book yet? Your stories are amazing. Thank you for bringing them to us to enjoy. And do you think you would write another book set in the same world? So perhaps a trilogy, not just a companion duology.
Well, actually, I have a number of ideas in my head, and I have to admit
that it would be Tilda. I'm just like so in love with her as a character.
Well, then you might be.
She's an actress, so you know.
You might be
my theater side of myself.
Yeah, well, there's a few books that I have in my head, and one of them's totally contemporary and has nothing to do with these two books. But the other one does, and I think that's the one that I'm pursuing at the moment. And Tilda does come back into this one, so I won't tell you too much about it because it's such early days, and I don't want to jinx it. But it's one of those things. It's an interesting thing, because I had never in my wildest dreams thought that this is what I'd do, that I'd stay in the same universe. But actually, I know other authors who do this, and I think it's probably accidental at first, just like it has been for me. Sebastian Barry, for instance, who's one of my favorite writers, he tends to write about the same family in every book. You don't need to know that. They're all totally separate books, but there's a family relationship between many of the characters. And I really love that idea, and I understand now why it might happen, because when you write a book, when I wrote Dictionary, I introduced characters like Tilda, for instance, just using her as an example, who I absolutely loved, but the story was not about her. And so I had to kind of limit how much I got to know her. But, you know,
she's larger than life. She is living her best life, you know, and just soaking up to do everything that she wants to do.
Yeah, but I was really interested in how a woman like Tilda, who books are normally written about because she's this sort of, you know, progressive, flamboyant actress, suffragette. I mean, you know, films and books are written about her. And that's why I didn't want to write about her, actually. I wanted to write about someone quieter and more ordinary. But I was curious about what happens to a woman like that, who is so strong. What happens to her during wartime? And so writing her character in Bookbinder was a very different experience, and so fascinating, because suddenly I could turn this character, who was perhaps a little two-dimensional, but on purpose, in the first book, because I didn't want her to take over that story. I could really round her out and make her complex and try and understand her a bit better. And I really loved doing that. And so I accidentally have just kind of fallen in love with these people and this time in history. And every time I write a book, I find out something fascinating that I can't write about because it's not part of the story I'm telling. And I squirrel it away. And I'm sure this happens to all writers, especially when you're doing a lot of research, you come across so much interesting stuff and you just can't fit it all into one book. But it does mean that there might be more books in that same.
Well, we are the benefit of that, and we are all rejoicing. I can tell everyone's cheering at home. Actually, leading on from that, there was Judy Edwards has said, I was in the covered market 2 days ago and I thought of Mabel in the Dictionary of Lost Words, and she is an essential character, but her impact was important for me. And can you just talk a little bit about her? Was she inspired by a real person? Mabel is just such a character indeed. You know, like Tilda, she just leaps off the page and you feel like you know her, you can see her, you can hear her, you know, the dialect that you give her.
Oh, thank you. She's not based on anybody in particular. I kind of hope, I'm pretty sure people like her exist. She's, you know, she's a complete figment of my imagination. But our imaginations are fed by everything we experience and see and read. So I'm sure there are Mabels out there. But one of the things and Tilda and Mabel and Gwen are examples of what I'm about to say. While these books, I know, have a lot of serious themes in them, something I think is important for me, at least, is to always have humor in a story. And sometimes the story itself has no humor in it. I mean, it can't, but there can always be humorous characters. And just like in everyday life, all of us know people who are just funny. Or they have an interesting turn of phrase, or a fascinating way of seeing the world, or a wry sense of humor. And so for me, it's really important to try and include people like that in my books, because otherwise they would be way too heavy, and there'd be no levity. So I think, you know, Mabel and Gwen and Tilda have a sense of humor. Just as human beings, they have a sense of humor and they bring that to the page. And I think we are all relieved that there is, you know, a bit of lightness in books that have otherwise quite heavy themes.
We're getting to the end. I wanted to just touch on what had been your experience of working in libraries that obviously led you to become a social researcher, and what kind of libraries you had kind of experienced in the writing of this novel. Obviously, going into Oxford, I know you had done some research as well at the South Australian Library, and I just wondered if you just touch briefly on your, I guess, your devotion to libraries and what they've given you.
Look, I've actually had a long relationship with libraries. The obvious, I was at libraries a lot as a child, borrowed a lot of books. But actually, I have worked in libraries, not as a librarian, but I used to work for the City of Adelaide, and I actually helped set up the City Library in Adelaide. I helped design it.
Oh, right.
And I helped with some of the programming of that library, which was just such a privilege. The State Library of South Australia has just been like a second home during these 2 books. Not only do they have the most beautiful set of original Oxford English dictionaries, but they have a bookbinder there called Peter Zajac, who taught me how to bind books so that I could describe that process in my novel. But also, and I have a little treat for you, he helped me to bind my own book. And this is one of 7 that I bound. It's a very simple binding, with a leather spine, but it's a hardbound copy of my own book. And I did this with my hands.
With your own hands.
And
something about crafting that, writing it, and then crafting to actually hold it. Yeah,
that's right. And I gathered the sections, I sewed them, I covered it in board, I did everything. I even did this very dodgy gilding. And all of that helped me to write Peggy's character better and Ebenezer's character better, because he is one of the men that works on the next side of the bindery. And I'm so grateful for all of the knowledge and expertise that librarians and libraries hold. I couldn't have written, I could never have done my job without them when I was a social scientist, but I couldn't have written these novels without them. And I'm incredibly grateful. I'm also grateful because so many of the talks I do are in libraries. And I know that so many people have come to my books by borrowing them, either through BorrowBox as an audio or a hard copy off the shelf. And I just think that's such an essential part of a society, is to have free access to books. That's what this book is all about.
Well, you feel like Peggy going into the library, and Esme, just their world of books, and it's that book within a book and the discovery of that. Actually, touching on the audiobooks, so obviously Belinda did produce the 2 audiobooks with Imogen Sage narrating the Dictionary of Lost Words, and Annabelle Tudor, who I love as a narrator, with all the narrations that she's done for us, the Bookbinder of Jericho. I mean, both of them beautifully encapsulate these characters, and with a pace and an energy and a rhythm and all their little voices. And I just wondered, are you an audiobook listener, and what do you think comes from actually being able to listen to stories like yours?
I always listen to audiobooks. So I'm dyslexic and I actually have trouble reading, which I know sounds really strange. I'm very, very slow. And also I can't read for very long. I just get mentally, and my eyes get tired. And so I just can't read for very long. If I didn't have access to audiobooks, I would read a fraction of the books that I do. And as a writer, I really feel I need to be reading books all the time. And I wouldn't be able to if it wasn't for audiobooks. The last book I just read, I just finished it yesterday actually, was The Iliad by Emily Wilson.
Right.
So her version, her translation of the Odyssey was actually really important in the writing of the Bookbinder of Jericho. And there's this little thread throughout that.
How they name women.
That's right. Yeah, the Odyssey is in that novel in various places, and it was Emily Wilson's translation that I had read. And now she's translated the Iliad, and I've just finished listening to that. And that's the kind of book I would not be able to read for a whole lot of reasons. And so I'm very grateful for audiobooks because they give me access to books that I would find so challenging I'd put them down. And
what did you make of Imogen and Annabelle's interpretation then of your words and hearing them sort of reflected back to yourself, or and making the choice? I assume that you had some choice in them being narrated.
I did. Yeah. So the way it works is I'm often sent 3 options, and then I choose the one that I prefer. And as long as there's some agreement with the other people involved, that's usually the person that we go with. I have to tell you a funny story. When I listened to Imogen's reading of the dictionary, it was the first time, because when you're writing, you don't necessarily know how to pronounce some of the words that you're writing down. And I had always written Mr. Sweetman as, that's in my head, I called one of the lexicographers Mr. Sweetman. He's a real person. Because I'm dyslexic, I didn't realize I can't spell sweet, obviously, or sweat. It's actually Mr. Sweatman, and I never knew that until I listened to Imogen reading the story, and I suddenly realized that in my head,
you've been calling your own character.
I had called him something completely different.
Right.
But weirdly, it had also influenced to some extent his character, because I gave him a sweet demeanor. Temperament, right, rather than a sweaty one. Could have been an entirely different book, an entirely different. I think it all turned out for the better.
Yeah, that's right. But that's really lovely. And I would say to any of one who's watching who hasn't read these books, or even if you have read the books, dive into the audiobooks. I mean, I really loved. I'd obviously read Dictionary of Lost Words in print, and then coming in preparation for this to hear Imogen read it 3 years later, it just brought everything to life in a really different way. And it just is almost like a friend talking to you and telling you this amazing story.
And the accents, an actor can do something with a text that you can't do yourself in your mind. And it's actually such an enriched reading experience very often, I think.
My last question, there's a quote in dictionary that says, some words are more important than others, but it took me a long time to understand why. And I wondered, in the writing of these 2 novels, what has it taught you?
Actually, I think it's what it's taught me is actually the importance of language to different groups of people. I don't think I appreciated, before I started writing dictionary, I don't think I appreciated so much what it means to lose a language. And I'm talking about Indigenous languages in particular. To lose your language means to lose meaning about your kinship, about your history, about your relationship to land or to other people. But it also means you lose a way of explaining and expressing that to others. And I think, the current, the current movement to reclaim language is so important. And it's something that I think is important, not just to Indigenous people, but to all of us, if reconciliation is actually something that's important. And I've said this many times, and then I remember realizing, I think it was my dad died this year, but before he died, I was talking to him about this, and then remembering that he's Welsh, and he grew up at a time when the British had outlawed essentially the teaching of the Welsh language in Welsh schools. And it was kind of confronting to realize that I actually also come from a language group whose language has been taken away. And all I can say in Welsh now is yucky da, which for the few people from Wales, they might understand that if I've managed to say it right at all. But my dad wasn't allowed to learn Welsh. When I lived in Wales for a little while, I was taught Welsh. It had come back into the school system, but he wasn't allowed to learn Welsh. And it's a tragedy.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the Bookbinder and the dictionary, it's that idea of gender and class and how words define us.
Yeah.
And how that restricts you. And I think that message really comes through, and race as well, like you're saying, and who gets to control who speaks and what you're allowed to say, and whose interpretation of history do we read in schools, in textbooks.
That's right. And, you know, the other thing to remember is that when you take away a language and insist that people speak your language, which in many ways is what, you know, a lot of early proponents of the Oxford English Dictionary wanted just proper words in the dictionary because they didn't value the language of the working classes or immigrants or people speaking English as a second language. They wanted everyone to speak proper English. That's a colonizing attitude. And we all know where colonization takes us and what it does to the people who've been colonized. So if we can't speak our language, and if our language and words are not allowed to sort of evolve naturally and be understood by us all, you know, what is it exactly that we're doing to different groups of people? We're devaluing them and their experience and the meaning that they ascribe to all those words that we don't approve of.
And we would not have words like knackered.
Exactly.
When we are absolutely beyond exhausted. And
what a useful word that is.
It's so useful. I love that scene. It's so good. I just want to thank you, Pip, for such a fantastic session. I've loved talking to you, and all of these little nuggets I feel like that we've got to know behind the writing of the book, and how your brain works to write this book, and the passion behind it. So I encourage everyone to go and get your BorrowBox app, which is free to download on your devices, and then use your library membership to get access to borrowing these titles. But we'll start with the Luke Hemsworth, One Italian Summer, because don't forget the young brother there. The Dictionary of Lost Words, and the Bookbinder of Jericho. And I know that if you've already read these, you haven't listened to them in audio, you will love reading them and listening to them again. We obviously said that we were recording this, and this is going to be going up on our BorrowBox YouTube channel, so you can let your friends know about it if they haven't been able to get here, or you can re-listen to it yourself. I want to thank my colleague Bridget, who's been working behind the scenes for all the tech support, and to Affirm Press, who are a wonderful independent Australian publisher that I love working with, and for helping make this online event happen. Thank you to the audience for joining us, for your questions. We weren't able to get to all of them, but I think we've covered a lot of bases of what's gone into going behind the writing of these stories. So I hope you've enjoyed it. And I know that you are going to enjoy these stories as much as I've enjoyed reading them. So get yourself into the reserve queue really, really quickly. And if the queue's really long, then tell your libraries they need extra copies. That's what I would say. But most of all, I want to thank you, Pip, for taking the time to talk to us about your work, about your passions, about your thought process. It's just been absolutely wonderful. I found it so illuminating. So thank you so much.
Oh, Tash, thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun. I wish I could have seen everybody, but I'm glad that they were all there. Thank you.
They're there, definitely. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and thank you from BorrowBox and myself and the team.